What's up everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we are looking at ways to make your smartphone footage look more professional. We're going to start with in-camera tricks that will enhance what you can do right out of your smartphone. And then we're going to move into some more advanced editing techniques that can be done in post. So for starters, my preference is to film video at 4K and 24 frames per second, and I'm filming slow motion at 1080 and 120 frames per second. Those are just my preferred settings, but you can also film at 1080 and 24 for your regular video. I just prefer 4K because it gets a little more detail and you also have the ability to crop in when you're editing. This first tip is super basic and every phone video tutorial is going to talk about this, but you have to lock your exposure and your focus. You do this by tapping and holding on your phone until you see that the little box is locked in place, and then you can also drag up or down if you want to brighten or darken your image. So one super cool technique that you can do on your phone is really easy, simple hyperlapses. You do this by heading into the time-lapse mode, and then you can just walk with your phone really slow, trying to keep it as steady as possible. And what you end up with is a super cool hyperlapse that you can throw into your B-roll sequences to really enhance them. So I'm not going to go into tons of detail about composition or camera movements, but a couple rules you can follow is, for one, the rule of thirds, which just means you keep your subject in any 1/3 of the shot, and this is just a better way to frame subjects. And beyond that, always look for unique angles and don't be afraid to get a little down and dirty to get some cool shots that you maybe wouldn't have thought of. Another really cool technique you can do in camera is this punch into focus effect. So you do this by getting really close to your subject, and then you're gonna lock the exposure and focus like we did before. And I'm darkening the image here. And all you're gonna do is pan slightly on the subject and then pull out quickly. And what this does is shows off your subject and then pulls it out of focus, which is cool, and you can do that right in camera. And then what I like to do to enhance that is in post, I play it in reverse and add a little speed ramp so you get this nice punching into focus effect. Here's another example, and you can get some pretty professional looking shots using this technique. So we've covered some really good in-camera techniques, but now I want to jump into my editing software and talk about a few more tips and tricks that can really take your footage to the next level. So first things first, color grading your footage can make a big difference. iPhone footage in particular tends to be really contrasty and have a lot of saturation. So one of the first things I like to do is just take down my contrast and take down my saturation a little bit too. And that gives you a much better starting point that already looks a lot closer to a DSLR or mirrorless camera. Beyond that, I'll tweak some of the other adjustments, but I usually tend to leave most things as they are. The last really important part of color grading is the white balance. I find that the footage that comes right off your iPhone usually has a pretty inaccurate white balance. So in Premiere, you can use these tint sliders up here to kind of adjust the white balance of your image. So I can tell in this shot that the pinks are a little bit too high. So to combat that, I'm gonna drag the tint a little more towards green, but be careful not to go too far with these sliders because you can definitely make your image look even worse if you aren't careful. I also like to cool down the image a little bit by dragging the tint towards blue, but that's just a personal preference, and sometimes the shot will look better if you warm it up. So I don't know if you guys noticed this, but in that opening sequence at the beginning of the video, one of my shots had a pretty clear depth of field where the subject was in focus and the background and foreground were out of focus a little bit. So I'm going to show you how to fake that depth of field look, and you can use this on all sorts of shots, but definitely be careful with it because if it's too obvious, it'll stand out and it won't look good. But if you're careful with it, this technique can make your phone footage look like it came straight out of an expensive camera. So once you have the shot that you want to add depth of field to, you're going to drag on an effect called Gaussian Blur. and we're gonna create a mask around our subject. So you can click on the clipping mask icon, and then you can start drawing a mask around your subject. Make sure to give some thought into what would actually be in focus and what wouldn't. And you're never gonna get it quite perfect, but in my case, I wanna start with just a little bit of the ground underneath the feet in focus, and I'm gonna work my way around the subjects until I've created a mask. You can see that if I add the blurriness, it's on them rather than the background. So I'm just gonna invert the mask, and then you can see we're already off to a pretty good start. Another thing you wanna do is increase the mask feather, and this just makes it look a little more seamless and you won't notice the edges as much. Lastly, since this shot has a little bit of movement, I'm gonna track the mask from the beginning of the shot to the end, and this can be done really easily. You just have the mask start off at the beginning of the frame, exactly where you want it, and you're gonna hit the mask path icon, so you drop a keyframe, and then you can move to the end of the shot, and you can see that my subjects are slightly askewed from where the mask is, so I'm just gonna grab a hold of the mask and slide it back on top of my subjects, and that's gonna drop one last keyframe at the end of the shot, and now you can see if we play it through, the mask is gonna follow along our subjects, and it should give us a really cool and pretty seamless effect. Filmmaking at its core is a very creative process. So in my case, before I had my camera or any fancy equipment, I was filming on an iPhone 6s and editing in iMovie. So I've heard this before, and I like to say it to people who are starting out in filmmaking, but frugality breeds creativity. And all that means is the less equipment you have, the less tools and resources, the more creative you're gonna be forced to get with what you do have access to. So when you're shooting on a phone, you don't have all the same capabilities that you would have with a mirrorless or DSLR camera, so you're gonna have to be more creative with it. So I'm gonna share a couple creative hacks just to give you an idea of the types of things you can look for when you're shooting on a phone. One technique that'll work really well with phone footage is giving it the old school Super 8 style look. I'm not going to give you a full tutorial on this, but the nice thing about this is it makes what you film super forgiving. So film really shaky, film uninteresting subjects, and what you're going to end up with when you add your effects is this old school Super 8 look, and it's a fun way to spice up a video. You can also play around with some color tints to the extreme. So for example, a popular effect I see especially in music videos is this night vision effect, and you do that super easily. You just do a green overlay on your footage, and that's just one way to turn terrible looking footage into something that now has purpose. And lastly, with phone footage, I find that a lot of cuts and interesting angles and close-ups is a good way to make the footage look a little more exciting, and you don't even notice that it wasn't shot on an expensive camera. Alright guys, that's gonna be it for this tutorial, but I hope you found some value in these different tips and tricks. And if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe and smash that like button for me. And if you have any questions, go ahead and leave me a comment, or feel free to DM me on Instagram, which is linked in the description. But otherwise guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.